May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Eat, Pray, Love, which is also a movie, is a true story of a woman on a personal quest that takes her to Italy, India, and Bali, where she eats, prays, and finds true love. In a travel, she discovers the true pleasure of nourishment by eating in Italy, enjoying pastas and ice creams for 4 months. She begins a spiritual journey not with strict practices, but by consuming big plates of pasta with total enjoyment. Now, eating is one of the most human and most necessary activities. We observe that meals are very important in Luke's gospel. In fact, Luke's gospel has more mealtime scenes than all the others. For Jesus, meals were an important occasion, and they were about much more than just devouring food. The meal was an occasion for talking and fellowship, and important things were said by Jesus in this public gathering. Now remember, this was a society without a radio, television, or newspapers, and meals were often large occasions with many people listening and reporting what took place. So on the occasion reported in Luke's gospel today, Jesus is invited to dinner with a leader of the Pharisee. Now we are not surprised that Jesus is dining as a guest of a Pharisee because he has done so previously. But we usually feel tension coming whenever Jesus and the Pharisees get together. The Pharisees may have been the people Jesus had some of his most significant run-ins with. And Jesus wasn't known for his politeness around the table, which often upset the leaders of the day. More than once he interrupted a meal to heal sick people on the Sabbath, as we heard in last week's gospel reading. Often he ate with dirty hands and he shared a table with riffraffs. But worst of all, he said things, blunt, embarrassing things no one cared to hear. And even though they were looking for any irregularities in Jesus' behavior, irregularities in what they considered to be the appropriate standard, Jesus still associated with them, still sat at the table and talked and disputed with them. And he did this even though he knew full well, as Luke reminds us here, they were closely watching him and all that he did. And maybe it's also good for us to watch Jesus closely, because by watching Jesus closely, we can appreciate the love of God and see what God tolerates in us and forgives us for. And so in today's passage from Luke's gospel, Jesus has already made a bit of a scene by once again healing on the Sabbath. It is then afterwards that Jesus taught a parable, which is part of our gospel reading today. Jesus played his role as an interested observer, and he noticed how guests are maneuvering for choice seats, the places of honor. Now, at an ancient meal, the table was usually in the shape of a U, and the host sat at the base. And the closeness of your place to the middle of the U indicated your importance to the host. Now, we know that Jesus frowned upon people who try to glorify themselves, and this prompted Jesus to say the following: when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host invited both you will come and say to you, give this person your seat, and then humiliated, you will have to take the least important seat. And so the moral that Jesus adds to the story says, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And this echoes the words of Mary's song of praise to God. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones, and he has lifted up the lowly. Now, many at the meal might have been expected to be at the head of the table, a position of status and importance. But rather than assume position of importance, Jesus talks about humility and respect for others. Jesus invites his hearers to rethink their places at the table and to imagine new ways of being in relation with those with whom they share a meal. Jesus then turns his attention to the host of the dinner and he says, instead of inviting those who can invite you back, Jesus tells him to invite those who are different from his usual dinner guests. So Jesus says when you give a lunch or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, Jesus says, invite the poor, invite the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now, meals were important for the people of God, but they had deteriorated into prideful practices where prominent people displayed wealth and hungry people went uncared for. And so the Pharisees thought that they were the ones invited to sit at the top of the table, and they hadn't bargained of Jesus turning the tables on them. But Jesus shows that pride and arrogance are dreadful things when they get in the way of our relationships. Now, many Jews couldn't see their need of God's grace and mercy because they considered themselves to be a chosen people already by God. And so to receive all that he had prepared for them by way of blessings, and this extended them thinking that those who were racially outsiders shouldn't receive it anyway. And so today's passage in Hebrews tells us what the marks of a Christian should be. It involved that thing called brotherly and sisterly love, and that it added hospitality. It had nothing to do with pride or arrogance, but an outward show of love and grace. So how do you and I avoid pride and embrace humility? Well, the writer of Hebrews talks about being content with what we have and have been given, whether it's wealth or a particular talent or ability. Because if we are, then it allows space for God to work with us and bless us and others further. And so to put others first, to consider those with no social standing to go ahead of us in the pecking order of life seems counterintuitive. Jesus wanted his followers to copy his example. He had few possessions, he gave up his authority, and Jesus became the servant of people. Now, the humble Mahatma Gandhi once said, acknowledged that he had been much influenced by the Gospels and touched by the life of Christ. And as he once remarked, he says, I might have become a Christian had it not been for Christians. Gandhi did not lead the masses by standing like a monarch above them, but he identified with them and he shared in their circumstances. He identified himself with the half-naked by rejecting his attorney's pence and costs and dressing himself with a loincloth and cotton shawl. While the other high estate Indian politicians were not willing to associate themselves with the untouchables, Gandhi chose to live, eat, and march with the untouchables, and he gave them a new dignity and a new name. He honored them by calling them the people of God. So we need to become the guests of God and the host of everyone else. As God's guests in this world, we should act humbly and remember that we are always in the presence of someone much greater than we. As a host of God's people, we should offer hospitality to those who cannot reward us. Surely we do not have to leave our friends and families out, but God calls us to invite those that are less fortunate than ourselves. And so, friends, we should choose the lowest place and never think of ourselves as better than anyone else, for all we are is due to God's grace. This is the way to form our hearts in humble gratitude and to live with that peace of heart that only true Christian humility can bring us. May God bless you richly. Amen.